Hello everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Aurorin Expounded. I absolutely love doing these episodes, they are so much fun, and I figured I've been kind of neglecting one of the biggest aspects when it comes to playing Dungeons & Dragons. Now, you probably heard me several times discuss leaving certain things vague so to help your players really fill out the character that they want to play, or to, let them have some influence over the world as you're creating the campaign around them. And for the majority of situations, this is true, hence the reason why I probably won't do an Aurorin Expounded video on classes and subclasses, because I want my players to have the freedom to completely flavor the classes how they want. So classes and subclasses just work as numerical things, and my players can rearrange how they look and how the vibe that they give off, regardless of what class or subclass they're playing. But there is one important thing that you also get to choose when you are making your character, and that is your character's race. Now, I like to offer as much player freedom as I can possibly offer, and so pretty much any current race is pretty much free game for my players to choose, including but not limited to wild mount races are certain things, and even things as recent as spelljammer races I allow my players to pick, even when playing within the context of the world of Aurorin. But because I allow this, I also then need to do the work to make sure that these races definitely fit within the world of Aurorin and aren't seen as some weird alien thing, unless the point of their race is to be a weird alien thing, a la any of the Gith. If my players decide to play a Gith at any point, they are aliens. In the context of Aurorin, Gith are aliens. But with all the naturally occurring races that inhabit the world of Aurorin, I do have to come up with the reason why they are there and why can my players choose them to play as. And that is what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, let's get into how the races as we currently know them have come about. Disclaimer, some of this is meta knowledge on the races, so even though scholars and things might not know all of this info within the context of the world, this one I feel having the meta knowledge is beneficial if you want to play in the world of Aurorin, helpful for both the players to help them completely visualize their characters, as well as DMs who want to run campaigns within the world of Aurorin. So let's start off with the humanoid races, which are humans, dwarves, and halflings. These races were all created by a collaboration of almost the entirety of the Soul Pantheon to come together in a moment known as the Potential. They started as almost a blank slate of flesh, bone, and muscle, and then were set out into the world to evolve into the original three races. Halflings evolved to be quick and nimble with the environments that they were set loose into, and as well as earned the favor of the goddess of luck, and it is now quite literally a divine power that is passed down through their heritage, this divine blessing of luck. The beings from this group that would eventually become dwarves settled in places that required such tough resilience against large predators, but also able to fit into smaller spaces, hence their stout nature and incredible strength and constitution. And the group of this creature that would eventually evolve into humans were basically filled in everywhere else. They were the Hufflepuffs of this race. They were the leftovers. And humans, to this day, still kind of are the default state of these blank slate creatures that were set upon the world as a collaboration of these gods and goddesses. They don't have anything that is really specific to them. They are the most malleable, adaptable, and versatile race on the face of Aurorin. Their greatest weakness is also their greatest strength. You can fit them in anywhere and they can thrive. They don't have any inherited blessings or really anything that is innately within them. Everything about a human is earned, so to speak. They are quite literally a blank canvas for the world, the gods, and any other outside influences to help paint them. So while dwarves and halflings evolved to fill a certain niche and particular lifestyle, humans embody the divine source of potential. And that kind of leaves them on their own to figure it out in a evolutionary kind of way. So in kind of a weird way, with humans basically being closely linked to the power of potential itself, it's almost as if humans are the default form of what life could be. But that's not to say that they are lesser. Oh no, quite the opposite, in fact. Humans, in their ability to be completely uninfluenced and sculpted and adaptable, their potential is their greatest strong suit. Is a human as nimble as a halfling? Well, not by default, but with enough energy and work, they could be. Is a human as stout as a dwarf? Well, not by default, but they could be. But that should be enough to cover the more basic races. So let's move something on to a bit more fantasy-ish, which is elves. Like humans, elves are super adaptable creatures, but they adapt differently. Through generations, their biology actually changes and adapts to fit the environment so they can thrive in it. But let's go even further back. The first of what would eventually become the elves was actually originally primordials created by the gods of the elements. These were some of the first intelligent creatures within the material plane, and they were the first to create several societies, and most of them kind of still exist as elementals within the elemental planes, creating their own, little off dimensions so they didn't have to fight with one another among the material plane. These primordial elves, also known as the Eldari, a few of them stay behind, not leaving to the elemental planes upon their creation, and they eventually, as the world became more of a planet, less than a rock of tumultuous elements, they began to adapt and change and evolved into the fleshy creatures we know them now as today. And once the more fleshy aspects of them went, they split into different tribes and migrated to different areas of the material plane and even off of the material plane. Elves that migrated into a very nature-dense, life-dense area would eventually evolve to become wood elves. The ones that were exposed to magic and arcane energies would eventually become high elves. The ones that found their way into the Fae would eventually transition into becoming the Eladrin, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, the ones that fell into the Shadowfell would eventually become Shatterkai, or as they are known in Aurorin, the Grey Elves, so on and so forth. However, there are some cases that rather than an environmental difference, it is a divine difference, such as the Shatterkai or Grey Elves. They didn't just happen to the Shadowfell by accident, they were invited in by the goddess of death. And the Moon Elves are blessed by the goddess of the moon. And just for a bit of reference, in the world of Aurorin, Moon Elves are the Astral Elves, so yeah. It is also worth noting that with the Elves, they actually also evolved into what would become the Gnomes later on, as those that went deeper underground. Henceforth, showing the gnomes' adapted nature in the difference between rock gnomes, forest gnomes, and deep gnomes, as deep gnomes evolved to match the Underdark and that environment. And the reason why the gnomes evolved differently from the elves is because, kind of like the halflings, the gnomes evolved in locations and ways that they need to be quicker and nimble to survive, and thus those traits were passed along. And yes, now the more I think about it, the more I realize that I put a lot of actual natural selection evolutionary theory into the creation myths in Aurorin. But, oh well, moving on. Next, let's talk about the Fae. The Fae are going to be pretty quick and simple. Basically, the Fae is an amalgamation of chaos and nature and emotion, a bright and colorful reflection of the material plane. The Fae was a creation by a god of chaos, a goddess of nature, and to basically be this melding pot of raw emotions. It is the Soul Pantheon's kind of weird off playground a little bit. So the Fae can actually now twist and make things chaotic on its own. It doesn't really need to be influenced by some outside force like an Archfey or a god or goddess. And so, as a result, the Feywild is kind of this melting pot, this mishmash of cauldrons spitting out weird things in a big fiery ball of chaos and plants and color. And so when it comes to Fey creatures, they kind of just happen. There is some logic to it, Fey creatures can have kids and then, their kid will be a Fey creature of the same species and things like that. But for the original ones, like the original fairy, the original Firbolg, all that kind of stuff, they just kind of became in this melding pot of chaos. And the reason why this part is so quick and I'm not talking about it much is there's not much to talk about. It just kind of is. So let's move on, I guess. How about goblinoids? Goblinoids, such as goblins, bugbears, hobgoblins, and actually orcs also fall under this category, aren't really fully related in the traditional sense. While bugbears, hobgoblins, and normal goblins do have some Fey ancestry, the orc doesn't, so why are these all lumped together? Well, the creation of these creatures comes from a problematic god of conquerors and tyranny. This god created the orcs and then marched his orc forces into the Feywild, and thus used the Feywild's power of creation and weirdness to create the other three as cannon fodder for his war. This god of war tried to throw over all the other gods in the pantheons, so they banded together and actually killed him. So the god of conquerors is dead, and now a god of honorable war is in his place. As a result, these four creatures are left godless, and as such, are kind of odd ones out a little bit. And that's why they're all kind of lumped together. Their source of divine creation is now lost to them. But as such, they kind of end up being akin to humans, is now they are kind of blank slates without that influence, leaving them with some pretty insane potential. And in some cases, some of the other divine gods have kind of adopted them into the fold a little bit. For example, the god Vulik, god of scavengers and resourcefulness, things like that, has actually kind of adopted goblins, and so now they are under his divine heritage. And that survival can translate into different things, such as becoming so good at a craft that you are a valuable contributive member to society in order to survive and take care of yourself. Or it could be traditional goblin stuff of we survive by banding together, forming raiding parties, and survival of the fittest kind of mentality. But that basically leaves these races kind of in an empty spot where they are open to outside forces, extra divine forces that can kind of come along and invite them into the fold, so to speak. And that's why they're all lumped together. But rather than races with nothing to inherit, let's move on to some races that inheritance is all they are. The inheritor races, basically, they inherit a bloodline, they're directly descended from something, or something entered their ancestry at some point, and those inherited traits are then basically formed into an entirely new race. For example, Dragonborn and Kobolds fall under the inheritor category, as they were basically just normal animals to begin with until they inherited the blood of dragons and evolved into much more formidable creatures. Same can be said for the tieflings. They were normal humans at one point, and then through some different ways, because there's different bloodlines of certain things happening, but through some way demonic or infernal power enters into the bloodline, and then they evolve eventually into tieflings, and then that spreads and basically breaks off and becomes their own entire race. And this also applies to the Genasi. The Genasi were also from that potential ancestry, the human ancestry, and then they kind of were infused with the power of the elements at some point within their bloodline way back when, to the point where it broke off so far that once again they are now their own race. Giants kind of work in this way too, as they were part of the same kind of elven race. However, they had so many outside influences that they almost instantly became a bigger, more monstrous version of the primordial elves. But that also explains why there's so many different types of giants and why they're so adaptable, like fire giants, frost giants, things like that, because kind of like elves, they adapt through their biology. Their biology changes to match their environment, and then they become almost an entirely different species on their own. Yuan-Ti also fall under this, as they are once again descended from the kind of humanoid line. However, at some point, the blood of the goddess Sithivius, which is the patron of the Yuan-Ti, and she is the goddess of assassins, poisons, shadows. She manifests as a snake. The blood from one of her vessels was actually sent into the bloodline at some point through some unknown circumstance, and that evolved the creatures that would eventually become humans. Instead of evolving that way, they were twisted and turned into more of a snake-like creature. Talking about the Yuan-Ti kind of leads us into our next category, the beast folk. Pretty much all of the beast folk, your tabaxi, your turtles, even your gif, as well as your hadozi, all of these animalistic creatures can all trace their origins back to the Crucible of Enlightenment. The Crucible of Enlightenment was created between a collaboration between two goddesses, D-Fourtress, the goddess of nature, animals, plant life, all that kind of stuff, and Aurorin, the goddess of knowledge and thought and magic. Aurorin kind of felt a bit bad for D-Fourtress, as all of her followers, so to speak, were unintelligent beasts and plants that didn't have the capacity to appreciate and worship her. So Aurorin came to her with the idea to create this crucible so she could actually have some peoples that were created from her. And thus, that crucible was used to infuse the already existing animals with enlightenment and evolve them into actual people. And this is true for almost every single beast race, except for one very specific one, the Lupirian. The Lupirian were created when a fragment of the Crucible of Awakening was stolen by Ruthrax, the god of predators, hunting, and he sought to create a powerful predator. And so he took that and used it on an already pretty successful group of predators, canines, specifically foxes and wolves. He sought to make a beast that was vicious and powerful, but was disappointed when, as the Crucible of Awakening affected these creatures, it did as it was intended and just turned the foxes and wolves into another people. And so, disappointed with his failure, the Lupirian were basically just cast off by him. Hence the reason why most Lupirian are from the continent of Miscald rather than Alishkar with most of the beast folk, as the fragment of the crucible was broken off and taken elsewhere to be experimented with. And in his failure, Ruthrax would leave them be, but eventually go off to create the Curse of Lycanthropy, getting the monsters that he wanted. But that is a story for another time. But when all is said and done, what happens when a creature kind of falls outside of the categories that were presented? Well, ones outside of these categories, basically their creation myth is so unique that, you know, they can't really fit within a category. They don't really share a common ancestor, or they are differently created between each member of that race. For example, take the Thri-kreen. In the world of Aurorin, the Thri-kreen are insectoid-like creatures that eventually were given sentience by an ancient wizard and then set loose upon the world, and they evolved a bunch of different insect types, all that stuff. And now, once again, they have evolved enough that they are just kind of people now. But if you want to get into weird stuff like a plasmoid or a warforged, I kind of leave that up to the player. How they were created can be part of the backstory. For example, if one of my players wanted to be a plasmoid, I would allow that, but they're not like an actually established race. But they could be, maybe they were just a slime that a wizard gave sentience, or maybe they were, if you're playing a plasmoid artificer, maybe they were just a dude that accidentally liquefied themselves and now they're a slime. Or if you want to go the Warforged thing, what I talked about in my War of Black Gates episode, the wizard known as Lexan, in order to escape his own mortality, he ripped the soul from his body, put it into automaton. Boom, now he's a Warforged. And you'll notice I excluded quite a few races, and that's because I don't really know that much about them to tweak their lore to go in, and I've never had any of my players ever express any interest in even playing or even meeting any of them, and that's like the races like Vidalkin or Simic Hybrid. But you can, just because I love them, you can bet that beast race, and they'll just fall into the beast races, but like Grung and Lokata are definitely a part of the world of Aurorin. Thank you all once more so much for watching. I love making these videos. I love just being able to nerd out about D&D, and one of my favorite things doing in D&D is creating characters, even though I don't really get to be a player that often because I'm the forever DM. Although, on the bright side, once I finish the Blood Money campaign, one of my players in that campaign is very gracious enough to let me be a player. And now that I can, I am being paralyzed by choice because I have no idea what I want to play because I don't know when I'll get the chance to be a player again. Don't get me wrong, I love DMing, but sometimes it'd be nice to play my own characters. Anyway, this is kind of a basic overview of just kind of letting the audience know, as well as my players know, kind of give them a foundation for a character to see where did this race come from, just so it's not like, oh, they're here because Dungeons and Dragons and they're included in Dungeons and Dragons. I love doing the world building for them, and I love asking the question why sometimes. And it could give, some people inspiration to run certain games or create their own worlds, and I love doing that. Maybe there could be a quest line that I could run, or if somebody wants to play in the world of Aurorin run, maybe you go across the this big adventure all throughout Alishkar to find the Crucible of Awakening, to just for a pure scholarly pursuit or something like that. Just being able to fill in the history with all these things just leads to so many other fun things that you can do down the road. But that's going to be it for me. But before I head out, just want to give a big, massive thank you to our patron, D-Four-Fan. Once again, our Patreon is up, and so you can do things like play with us on Discord. You get exclusive Discord access, possibly exclusive merch and merch discounts, all the things like that. And for patrons, you could have seen this video up to 1 week early to be able to enjoy it before anybody else, so I think that's kind of cool. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I am your humble DM, G. Blaine Thompson, and I wish you all a great day. Bye-bye.